This passage is about truth and power. And he raises a question that can we gain power through truth? I mean, being truthful, can it give us power? He says, well, it seems to be a myth. I mean, it's a false belief, maybe a comforting myth, but then he says truth and power, you see, have a more complex relationship because in human society, you see, power means two different things. And in the second paragraph, he talks about what power means. So, number one, he says the power is having the ability to manipulate objective reality. And number two, he says power is the ability to manipulate human beliefs. These are two things about power. He says that if you speak the truth, people may not unite. But if you speak fiction, if you speak stories, right, people possibly might unite. That is the source of power. Truth may not have many followers. There's an old saying, you see, the truth doesn't have many followers. But fiction story, which is akin to a lie, you see, they have many followers. So he talks about the advantages of fiction, you see. And these advantages of fiction are advantages over truth. And he talks about three things in the third paragraph. Number one, he says truth is universal. It's all over the world. So people may not pay much attention to it. But fiction is local, you see. What do you mean by local? That is, you can talk about stories in your community, in your society. People will believe you. Now, the second advantage is he talks about the handicap principle. And what is that handicap principle? The handicap principle is, that is, you get people to believe, you get people to grow loyal, and people do that after listening to stories, right? And the third, he says about truth, it is painful and disturbing. So people don't want to follow truth. It's very painful and disturbing. Sometimes, or for most part of the time, if you speak the truth, people may not like you. People may not follow you, right? And the last paragraph, he tells you that fictional stories can bring people together. It is cohesive, but truth, you see, doesn't do so. People run away from truth. They don't unite. So he is being very down to earth in his description. And this is the passage about power and truth. Now let's look at the questions here. You have the first question here regarding which one of the following quotes could we argue that the author overemphasizes the importance of fiction. He has taken four quotations from the passage, and you have got to read each of these quotations and decide for yourself which one of them you see rather exaggeratedly emphasizes the importance of fiction. In fact, truth and power have a far more complicated relationship because in human society, power means two different things. The first one doesn't talk about fiction. The second one, scholars often had to decide whether they serve the truth or social harmony. Should they aim to unite people by making sure everyone believes in the same fiction, or should they let people know the truth? Now, this is something he has talked about, but let's come to number three. Hence, sticking with the truth is the best strategy for gaining power. Unfortunately, this is just a comforting myth. So, this doesn't again talk about fiction. I mean, there has to be a line of overemphasizing the importance of fiction, you see, but we don't have. There's no line about fiction in number three. On the one hand, power means saving the ability to manipulate objective realities, to hunt animals, to construct bridges, to cure diseases, to build apps. That is power, you see, ability to manipulate things. But it doesn't say anything about fiction. So what you have, you see, it's the correct option is number two. And in number two, look at the overemphasis, you see. That is, scholars often had to decide whether they serve truth or social harmony. Now, if you serve social harmony, if you want to unite people, then you have to be what you call come out. You have to come out with fiction. You have to come out with a lie. Then only people will unite. So that seems to be an overemphasis on fiction. So the correct option is number two. Let's come to the next one. The author would support none of the following statements about political power except that. Yes, except one. He wouldn't support, you see, any of these statements except one. People cannot handle the unvarnished truth, so leaders retain power by deviating from it. That is the exception. So number one is the correct option. There are definite advantages to promoting fiction, but there needs to be some limit to a pervasive belief in myths. He doesn't talk about the limitations, you see, of the, okay? So he wouldn't support that. Manipulating people's belief is politically advantageous, but a leader who propagates only myths is likely to lose power. Where has this thing been said in the passage? While unalloyed truth is not recommended, leaders should stay as close as possible to it. No, this hasn't been taken up in the passage. The correct option is number one. The next question, the author implies that, like scholars, successful leaders, number one, use myths to attain the first type of power. No, that cannot be the answer. Today, know how to create social cohesion better than in the past. We don't have anything about the comparison between the past and the present in the passage. Need to leverage both types of power to remain in office. No, we are not only talking about the two kinds of power. We are talking about truth and power, and know how to balance truth and social unity. So that is the correct answer. Social harmony, social unity. So number four is the correct option. Now let's come to the next one. The central theme of the passage is about the choice between. I mean, is the central theme the choice between truth and power? No, it's not exactly that. Stories that unite people and those that distinguish groups from each other? No. Attaining social cohesion and propagating objective truth. Yes, that is the central idea. You see, that is, even if you attain social cohesion, how are you going to propagate objective truth? Because it becomes a little contradictory that if you were to propagate objective truth, there may be lack of social cohesion. People don't follow truth. So that is the central idea in the passage. So number three is the correct option. Now let's come to the next passage. This is about the colonizer. What do you mean by the colonized and the colonizer? That is, for instance, once upon a time, the British ruled over us in India. So we were colonized and they were the colonizers. Now, in this entire passage, he's talking about the what goes into colonization and what goes into the colonizers' psychology. You see, the idea is how we were colonized. You see, in paragraph number one, we were colonized, you see, by the dominance of materialism. You see, that is, the Europeans, the Englishmen who came here, you see, they were extremely materialistic, and they had all superior techniques, you see, of material life, which they had, you see, in their culture. And they used that materialistic approach to colonize other people. And they succeeded in doing that. But this, at the same time, in India, people were learning those materialistic techniques, but at the same time, they were not ready to give up their own independence of thinking, their self identity, which was being threatened. They were not ready to give that up. We didn't convert, you see, to the English way of thought or the English way of religion. Indians remained as Indians, you see. That is the point he's trying to make out, right? In spite of all the effect of materialism upon the people, in spite of all the effect of the dominance of materialism, people, you see, the colonized people retained their self identity. Okay, so that is the main point he makes out here. And in the second paragraph, he expands on this point, the point that he has made between self identity, that is, the spiritual aspect of Indianism and materialism. He says that there are binaries operating. What do you mean? That is, the colonized didn't want to copy the Westerners. If they did, you see, then it would be very much far from original. But he says the discourse of nationalism shows what I just read out this line. He has put a slash, you see, between the material and spiritual. That is the binary. Now, what do you mean? The material represents the Western, the spiritual represents the Eastern. The material represents the Englishman or the European. The spiritual represents what you call the Indian. So by this argument, you see, what he says is the material is the world and the home is what you call the spiritual. By this argument, the inner is the spiritual and the outer is the material. True identity is to be located in the spiritual, not in the material. And if it's a question of world and home, well, the world, it's represented by man and home is represented by woman. Now, what do you mean by home is represented by woman? It's because taking care of everything, you see. So that is spiritualism. So again, you have that opposition between what you call the inner and the outer. The European system was the outer, the materialistic, the worldly, the earthly, whereas the Indian system was religious, inner, spiritual. And then he talks about the Gar and the Bahir. You see, he uses these two terms from Hindi, the Gar and the Bahir. The Gar represents what he called the home, that is the Indian spiritualism, and Bahar represents what you call the Western materialism. And your gender correspondence, you see, goes to inner and outer. And the next paragraph, he discusses what you call the colonial and the ideological response to the critique of Indian tradition. And what does he say here? Whatever we may have been colonized materially, our cities were colonized, our cities, our districts, our states were ruled over by the English. The entire country was ruled over by the English, but they could not rule the minds of Indians. I mean, had they colonized the minds of Indians, then perhaps we would have never thought of fighting for independence. We would have got, you see, possibly rid of our culture, of our rich heritage, of our religion, and everything. But we didn't. Indians, you see, they remained Indians in their innermost identity. They could never be colonized that way. So now we can come to the questions here. Which one of the following explains the contradictory pulls on Indian nationalism? Number one, despite its fight against colonial domination, Indian nationalism had to borrow from the colonizer in the spiritual sphere. Is that it? I don't think the Indian nationalism had to borrow from the Western. It may have been the other way around. We had nothing to borrow spiritual from them. Despite his fight against colonial domination, Indian nationalism had to borrow from the colonizer in the material sphere. Yeah, that is true. That is a contradictory pull because we weren't materialistically advanced and we had to borrow from them. So the answer is number two. Despite its spiritual superiority, Indian nationalism had to fight against colonial domination. No, that's not the thing. That's not a pull. That's not a contradictory pull. Despite its scientific and technological inferiority, Indian nationalism had to fight. That is not a contradictory pull. So our correct answer is number two. Now let's come to the next question. Which one of the following, if true, would weaken the author's claims in the passage? Yes, he had made several claims. Indian nationalists rejected the cause of English education for women during the colonial period. Well, the passage doesn't say all these things. The Industrial Revolution played a crucial role in shaping the economic prowess of Britain in the 18th century. No. The colonial period saw the hybridization of Indian culture in all realms as it came in contact with British European culture. So this would weaken what you call the author's claim in the passage. Were we to accept this point that in all realms, in all fields, we were totally influenced by European or British culture. So the correct option is number three. The next one. Which one of the following best describes the liberal perception of Indian nationalism? Okay. Indian nationalism sophistication resided in its distinction of the material from the spiritual spheres? No. Indian nationalism embraced the changes brought about by colonialism in Indian women's traditional gender roles? No. Indian nationalist discourses reaffirm traditional gender roles for Indian women. Yes, doesn't it talk about that? The man-woman binary. Man represents the world. Man represents the materialistic. Man represents the outer. Man represents Baha. That's what he says. And woman represents home. Woman represents the spiritual. Woman represents control. Woman represents, you see, the inner. That's what he said. So number three is the correct option. We come to the next question. On the basis of the information in the passage, all of the following are true about the spiritual material dichotomy of Indian nationalism, except that what is that? Number one, represented that it represented a continuation of age-old oppositions in Indian culture, was not as ideologically powerful as the inner-outer dichotomy, constituted the premise of Gar-Bahir dichotomy, help in safeguarding the identity of Indian nationalism. You see, the correct option is number one, represented a continuation of age-old oppositions in Indian culture. Now, let's come to the next passage. This is a passage about languages, their fate, monolingualism, multilingualism, and in this paragraph, he discusses the disappearance of some languages, the threat to some languages, the endangered languages you see. In the first paragraph, he's talking about the threat to language, the disappearance of language you see. The point that he's trying to make here is some languages may have no written form, orality is fragile and it's vulnerable, and sometimes what happens is there is a threat to the languages. And the second paragraph, he talks about language shift. Now, what do you mean by language shift? What happens is, for in our own country, you have seen for yourself that when the English came and ruled here, somehow we sidelined, you see, our own languages, you see, in a sense, and people were more and more opting for English. That is, you shift from one language to another language. But sometimes it becomes very dangerous. Why dangerous? Because what happens is, he gives you the example of Tasmania, I think, where he points out that the whole community was wiped out by the colonizer and the language also was wiped out. The loss of language, the entire language was wiped out. That is only because of what you call monolingualism. What do you mean by monolingualism? That is the colonizer or any group or any community which is powerful wants to propagate, wants to what you call popularize the language that it speaks. It doesn't want the other languages to survive. And this happens. This happened, of course, in many countries when the British were ruling. They tried to popularize, you see, their own language, that is the English language. And the result was the other indigenous languages or the other languages, you see, of that country, you see, they suffered a lot. Like as it happened in India. But multilingualism would be different. You see, he talks about multilingualism. That would, of course, help, you see, in retaining languages and support, you see, indigenous and scholar communities. Because multilingualism is connected to the world at large. Now, let's come to the questions. He says we can infer all of the following about indigenous languages from the passage except that. Let us see. People are increasingly working on documenting these languages. Yes, they are working, right? Because they are scared that languages would disappear. They are repositories of traditional knowledge about the environment and culture. We have them. They are in danger of being wiped out as most can only be transmitted orally. That is a problem. Languages which have no written form, they are always in danger, you see, of being wiped out. Their vocabulary and grammatical constructs have been challenging to document. You can't infer this. He doesn't say anywhere that the vocabulary and grammatical constructs, you see, were challenging, and that's why languages are being, you see, are disappearing or they are not being documented. It doesn't say that anyway. So number 4 is the correct option. The author lists all of the following as reasons for the decline or disappearance of language except governments promoting certain languages over others. That could be the reason that one language, you see, is promoted over the other, then the other languages lose importance. A catastrophic event that entirely eliminates a people and their culture, as it happened in Tasmania. The focus on only a few languages as a result of widespread internet use. Now, that is the answer. You see, this is not a reason for that. So, number 3 is the correct option. Now, the next question is, from the passage, we can infer that the author is in favor of what? Language shifts? No. Language shifts is what you call a loss sometimes. Cultural homogenization? No, he doesn't say that. An expanded state role in the preservation of languages? Nothing has been said there. You have to infer, and what the author talks about is multilingualism. Therefore, number 4 is the correct option. Let's look at the next question. The author mentions the Welsh language to show what? Efforts to integrate Welsh speakers in the English speaking fold have been fruitless. Does he mention that Welsh language for that? No. Vulnerable languages can rebound with state effort? No. Languages can revive even after their speakers have gone through a language shift. That is the point. He says the Welsh, you see, possibly started speaking in English and then you see it's again recalled. So number 3 is the correct option. Now let's come to the next passage you see. This is a little bit philosophical. It is rambling, written a rambling style. So you have to just try to understand what he's trying to say here. He using the word, you see, the problem of knowledge, and he says that is the scandal of philosophy. Now, what does he mean by that? In the first and the second paragraph, in both these paragraphs, you see, he is contending, well, if you're talking about knowledge, how do you know it is knowledge? What makes you think that it is knowledge? You see, that is a question that has been raised by philosophers and others. He says that knowledge cannot be obtained. If you say that, and why do you say that knowledge cannot be obtained? Because of skepticism. Now, what do you mean by skepticism? That is, you start doubting everything. For instance, you start doubting the creation, you start doubting your own existence, you start doubting your own entity. Then how can you possibly talk about knowledge? You raise questions like who I am, what I am. For instance, some philosophers say, how do we know that we are alive? We may be dead, and those people who are dead may be actually alive. It's we decided, it's humankind decided that such and such people are dead, who show such and such symptoms, and such people are alive who show such and such symptoms of liveliness or liveliness. It's we who decided that. Now that is basically questioning everything. You're questioning everything. You're questioning your existence. You're questioning, you see, man. You're questioning nature. You call a tree a tree. Why do you call it a tree? Why don't you call it a lion? Why don't you call the lion a tree and the tree and the lion? We do all these things only because humankind decided that. It was not something which was ontological, which was in its origin, you see. It was human beings who decided, well, this is knowledge. I'm going to call this thing, and this is knowledge, and this is ignorance. Now, the skeptics, you see, the doubters, skepticism means the doubters, one who doubts, you see, who raises questions about such existence. So he says that if we say that all that knowledge is illusion, all that knowledge we talk about is not knowledge, and we don't, if we doubt that, then anything and everything based upon that knowledge would also be illusory. Now, that would create a great deal of panic and confusion in the entire world. The moment you start doubting everything that exists in the world, then all your space jets and planes and all these things and all knowledge that you have would be put into what you call skepticism, put into doubt whether they exist or not. And if they exist, then how do they exist, right? Because the point is, he says that we don't know what is reality and what is illusion. It is we decided, well, this is reality and this is illusion. But then it may be the other way around. Well, the reality may be an illusion and the illusion may be a reality. Now, if we come up with such arguments, that was the scandal of philosophy. You see, that would actually put everything into doubt. The skepticism that is raised, the doubt that is raised, would demolish, you see, practically all knowledge, you see, it would demolish. And if this happens, then how do you account for what you call all that's happening in the world? So this is the point that he has raised in the first two paragraphs. Then you say in the third paragraph, he says that, well, if such a situation is, we have got to ignore these things. But that is not the argument in the passage, you see. The argument in the passage is about skepticism, knowledge, reality, illusion. That's the central point here, right? So let's come to the questions now. The question says, the author discusses all of the following arguments in the passage except that. Yes, he's discussing the argument about what you call the reality, the illusion, knowledge, skepticism, all these things. He discusses, you see, those arguments, but the one argument that he doesn't discuss in detail is, and which doesn't form the central idea, is the best way to deal with skepticism about the veracity of knowledge is to ignore it. Veracity means truthfulness of knowledge. So that is the correct option. Number 2 is the correct option. The next question. We cannot catch a glimpse of things in themselves around the corner of our eyes. We cannot form an idea of reality that floats above the processes of our conceiving it. Which of the following statements best reflects the argument made in the sentence? See, I just told you about reality and illusion. What does he say here? We cannot catch a glimpse of things in themselves around the corner of our eyes, and we cannot form an idea of reality that floats above the processes of our conceiving. Right? Now, if the reality of things is independent of our perception, logically we cannot perceive that reality. The point is, when you see reality, when you look at things, right? And if those things are away from independent of your perception, then obviously you cannot see them. You see, now you are seeing me, right? For instance, you can see me when I speak, and you know that is real only because you can perceive me. If reality were independent of any perception, then that would not be a reality. Then people cannot perceive it. So the correct option is number 1. The next question. According to the last paragraph of the passage, we hold our beliefs and presumptive knowledges more or less confidently, usually depending on something. Which one of the following most broadly captures what we depend upon? Yes, he says usually depending on something. Now, what is that something? How much of a stake we have in them, what resources there are to support them? No. How we come to hold them, how widely they are held in our social circles. That is the correct option. Number 2 is the correct option. Remaining outside the academy, ignoring epistemic anxieties? No. All the options listed here, no. So the correct option is number. The author of the passage is most likely to support which one of the following statements? The scandal of philosophy is that we might not know anything at all about reality if we think of reality as independent of our perceptions, ideas, or description. Yeah, that is the same point that is raised in question 14, right? So that is the answer here. Now we come to the next question, the jumbled up sentences here. I think in he's talking about what you call the advertising world, where the potential is being widely discussed and it is being claimed as the undeniable wave of the future. There is little enthusiasm for this in the scientific arena. For them, marketing is not a science. And only a handful of studies have been published in scientific journals. The new growing field of neuromarketing attempts to reveal the inner workings of consumer behavior and so forth. Some see neuromarketing as an attempt to make the art of advertising into a science being used by marketing experts to back up their proposals with some form of real data. The marketing gurus have already started drawing on psychology in developing tests and theories of advertising. People have borrowed the idea of focus group from social science. So, you see, the first four have to do with marketing, with the advertising world. The last one, you see, talks about drawing on psychology and other and developing tests and other things. So number 5 is the odd one out. Now let's come to the next question. You have to arrange them in a coherent paragraph. He says, look forward a few decades to an invention which can end the energy crisis, change the global economy, and curb climate change at a stroke commercial fusion power to gain meaningful insights. Now he's talking about, see, you have the word insights in number 2 and insights in number 3. They are related somehow. Now, if how they are related, let's see. The greatest of all inventions is the Uber invention that has provided the insights on which others depend, the modern scientific method. And then to gain meaningful insights, logic has to be accompanied by asking probing questions of nature through controlled tests, precise observations, and clever analysis. So the first two sentences should be 3 and 2. And after second, we have number 1. Looking forward to invention, and after 1, we have number 4. So the correct answer is 3, 2, 1, 4. Let's look at the next question. And in this passage, he's talking about the employer and the employed. He's talking about the capitalist and the working class. Let's see how it goes about. The unlikely alliance of the incumbent industrialist and the distressed unemployed worker is especially powerful amid the debris of corporate bankruptcies and layoffs. In an economic downturn, the capitalist is more likely to focus on costs of competition emanating from free markets than the opportunities they create. And the unemployed worker will find many others in a similar condition and with anxieties similar to his. I mean, both of them, whether the capitalist who's looking to the market or the unemployed who's looking for the job, they are both in a state of anxiety, you see, which will make it easier for them to organize together. Using the cover and the political organization provided by the distressed, the capitalist captures the political agenda. Now let's look which one of these you see is the best summary. He says an economic downturn creates competition. I think number one doesn't talk about the central thing in the passage, you see. It simply says that the capitalists capture the political agenda created by the political organization provided by the unemployed. No, that is untrue. An unlikely alliance of the industrialist and the unemployed happens during an economic downturn in which they come together to unite politically and capture the political agenda. I don't think that is a very good summary, you see. The third one, in an economic downturn, capitalists use the anxieties of the unemployed and their political organization to set the political agenda to suit their economic interests. I think that is the best summary, you see. So number three is the correct answer. The others don't talk about, you see, the anxiety in full. Let's come to the next question. So let's look at the sentences. The care with which philosophers examine arguments for and against forms of biotechnology makes this an excellent primer on formulating and assessing moral argument. Now, we don't know what this refers to here. We just keep that in mind. Okay, but we'll look at the other sentences. Although most people find at least some forms of genetic engineering disquieting, it is not easy to articulate why what is wrong with re-engineering our nature. Breakthrough in genetics present us with the promise that we will soon be able to prevent a host of debilitating diseases. So number two talks about genetic engineering. Number three carries that forward about genetic knowledge of diseases. And number four, to grapple with the ethics of enhancement, we need to confront questions that verge on theology, which is why modern philosophers tend to shrink from them. Ethics of enhancement, morality comes in. Why? Because when you're talking about genetics and genetic engineering, then the question of morality crops up. One argument is that the drive for human perfection through genetics is objectionable, as it represents a bid for mastery that fails to appreciate the gifts of human powers and achievements. Number one talks about biotechnology, and two, three, four, five, they are talking about genetic engineering. Number one is the odd one out. The answer is number one. Let's come to the next question here. Look, what it says here is creativity is now viewed as the engine of economic progress. Various organizations are devoted to its study and promotion. There are encyclopedias and handbooks serving creativity research, but this proliferating success has tended to erode creativity's stable identity. It has become so invested with value that it has become impossible to police its meaning and practices that supposedly identify and encourage it. Many people and organizations committed to producing original thoughts now feel that undue obsession with the idea of creativity gets in the way of real creativity. Now, look which one of these is the best summary. The value assigned to creativity today has assumed such proportions that the concept itself has lost its real meaning, and this is hampering the engendering of real creativity, right? That is, creativity has been so much overworked and overdefined that it's sometimes difficult to what you call find out what real creativity is. So that is number one. Let us look at number two. The industry that has built up around researching what comprises and encourages creativity has destroyed the creative form process itself. Does he say that there? I don't think that is said in the passage. The obsession with original thought, how it can be promoted in research, has made it impossible for people and organizations to define the concept anymore. What concept is he talking about? Do we know that? No. So that cannot be a good summary. You see, he doesn't talk about creativity, right? And creativity has proliferated to the extent that it is no longer a stable process. Now that is more or less a copy of the original. You see, the words and the things. The good summary is number one. The next question: biologists who publish their research directly to the web have been labeled as rogue, but physicists have been routinely publishing research digitally prior to submitting in a peer-reviewed journal. Advocates of preprints argue that quick and open dissemination of research speeds up scientific progress and allows for wider access to knowledge. But some journals still don't accept research previously published as a preprint. Even if the idea of preprints is gaining ground, one of the biggest barriers for biologists is how they would be viewed by members of their conservative research community. So now you know what the passage is about. It's about the biologist and the physicist, you see, bringing out articles in the MAT. And number one, it says preprints of research are frowned on by scientific fields as do not undergo a rigorous reviewing process but are accepted among biologists as a quick way to disseminate information. No, that's not a very good summary, you see, and it doesn't contain the whole truth there. Compared to biologists, physicists are less conservative in their acceptance of digital pre-publication of research papers, which allows for faster dissemination of knowledge. That you see is a good summary because it brings in the comparison of the biologist and the physicist. That is what the passage is about here. So number two is the correct summary, you see. You can leave the others. He says that one of the advantages of digital preprints of research is that they hasten, but it doesn't talk about the biologists and the physicists, you see. And the last also doesn't talk about the biologists and the physicists, you see the comparison. So number two is the best option. Let's come to the next one. Number one, but today there is an epical change. Now, you can't start it with but today. That means something has already been said, you see, before. Number three says this calls for. What calls for? We don't know. So number three cannot be the first sentence. Half a century ago, development began as a hope for a better human possibility. And then you have two. We are at a crossroads now in our vision and practice of development. So I think the first sentence should be two. Two is more general, you see. It talks about the vision and the practice of development. And four talks about development began as a hope for a better human possibility. So two should be followed by four. But today there is an epical change. You see, after four, it's one. And after one, it is three, of course. This calls for such and such thing. It's two, four, one, three. Now, let's come to the next question. The US has long maintained that the Northwest Passage is an international strait through which the commercial and military vessels have the right to pass without seeking Canada's permission. Canada, which officially acquired the group of islands forming the Northwest Passage in 1880, claims sovereignty over all the shipping routes through the passage. Now, number two is a general statement, you see, about what Canada had done. So, number two is the sentence that should come first. And then through the passage, then after the two, you have one. The US has long maintained that the Northwest Passage is an international strait, right? After two, I think you should have number one. And after one, you have the US and Canada have never legally settled the question of access through the passage. That is four. After one, it is four. And finally, it is three. So the final answer is 2, 1, 4, 3. If you look at this sentence, you see, if you begin this sentence by saying Canada, which officially acquired the group of islands forming the Northwest Passage in 1880, you see, claims sovereignty over all the shipping routes through the passage. And then you see, it's about, what do you call, it talks about claiming sovereignty over the passage, and then in one you have the US has long maintained that the Northwest Passage is an international strait, right? And since this is a matter of dispute, that is why you have four, where you say they have never legally settled the question of access.